Some places give birth to legends like Venus from the island of Cythera, while 430 King's Road in London gave birth to a legend as well. Hello everyone, Lally here yet again with another fashion deep dive for you, and I hope you're ready for it because today's video is going to be jam-packed. We are just going to jump right in because we've got a lot to cover if I want to make this into 4 videos. And yes, this is going to be my first series, so just bear with me. I promise to try to keep everything on track, including myself, but no promises, but we have to begin. Because today, tomorrow, the next day, and the day after that, we are going to be talking about an icon, both culturally and environmentally, who was so ahead of her time that other designers turned to copying her work and turning it into mainstream masterpieces. She was a self-confessed fashion anarchist and queen of punk. Today we are talking about the one, the only Vivienne Westwood. A daughter of the industrial North who underwent her formative years at a very crucial point during World War II, when DIY became a part of everyday life, a lifestyle that helped to power Vivienne's own nihilistic punk ethos, and with the help of McLaren, they created punk and built their careers on it. Through punk, Vivienne broke the status quo and allowed a group of angry and angsty youths to rise up against a system that didn't care about them. She understood early on that clothing could be its own language by pushing, pulling, and playing with the grammar and syntax of the work, like wearing a rubber bondage suit on a commuter train in London, or adding holes to the chest of a t-shirt. Her work defined and incited rebellion. No matter the decade, Vivienne never conformed to the direction fashion went and prided herself on her unorthodox ways. She was inconsistent, non-commercial, often unwearable, and even after denouncing punk, she was anti-establishment, no matter how hard and desperately she tried to fit in. And towards the end of her career, she still continued to find ways of spreading her message, no matter how controversial, whether that be anti-establishment, anti-government, freeing Julian Assange, freeing Palestine, or climate change. Vivienne Westwood allowed her work as a designer to be the foreground to her battles. She was anti-bourgeois, and there are streaks of rebellion in her work that she never compromised on. Vivienne became a designer for the people. Her work influenced so many, including Christian Lacroix, who found success with crinoline 2 years after Vivienne's Harris Tweed collection, and Karl Lagerfeld, who found success with tweed corsets at Chanel years after Vivienne. She is often named one of the 6 most important designers of the 90s, ranking among the likes of YSL, Emmanuel Ungaro, Giorgio Armani, Karl Lagerfeld, and Christian Lacroix. Despite all the odds stacked against her, almost going bankrupt, having no money to eat, being a single mother with 2 children, she entered the world of fashion with very little experience at middle age, and despite everything, Vivienne Westwood survived and thrived. But by now you know the drill, and in order to understand all that Vivienne Westwood was, we must start at the beginning. So let's freaking do this. And I guess I should have said this earlier, but we are going to be discussing a lot of explicit content. That really just comes with the territory of talking about Vivienne Westwood. And I'm going to make this statement now that I do not condone the imagery or ideologies we will talk about, but we will definitely be talking about everything today, tomorrow, the next day, and the day after, because that's the point. We have to get the whole story in order to understand Vivienne Westwood. So yeah, enough of me talking. Vivienne Isabel Swire was born April 8, 1941, to her parents Dora and Gordon Swire. Dora was a ballroom dancer, and that is how she met Gordon. Like fate, 2 weeks before Christmas, she went to Glossop to buy a new ballroom dress and missed the last bus home, so she had to walk to another stop on the outskirts of town when she passed St. Mary's Dance Hall, where Gordon Swire was standing outside. They had known each other for decades, but that night he walked her home, and it was on that walk, like a cosmic shift, that they knew this was it. They married in 1939, 2 weeks before the start of World War II, and soon after, the couple had Vivienne, a war baby born on the night London suffered the heaviest air raids of World War II. She was born in Derbyshire, but raised in Tintwistle between Cheshire and Derbyshire, in the English countryside, covered by steep hills and a river. To the west, in Lancashire, the cotton industry boomed, and to the east, in Yorkshire, the wool industry had been established. and around 80% of Vivienne's town worked in the cotton mills, as they provided a livelihood for most of their families, including the Swires. Which is why Vivienne retained a sentimental but informed appreciation of the qualities of traditional English textiles like starched cottons, worsted pinstripes, fine gauge knits, satin, and Harris tweed, all of which inspired a nostalgic strand of passion and yearning for the past, which would later become her signature. Born during World War II, Vivienne was no stranger to rationing. It was all she knew. She didn't even try a banana until she was 7 years old. Things were very scarce. But Vivienne's mother Dora worked very hard in the mills, making sure her children had clothes to wear and food to eat. Thrift was a main theme of their childhood and life, as up until the age of 10, rationing was heavily enforced in Britain. The British government had demanded self-sacrifice from their people to rebuild the nation, deploying slogans like "Make, Mend, and Do" as an exhortation to frugality. Even in school, the children were taught to sew, set cloth, and chain stitch. By 5 years old, Vivienne even knew how to make a pair of shoes. Thrift and DIY were embedded in her DNA. It was a necessity and thus remained an intrinsic part of her character, never allowing herself to overindulge in consumption, because while the monarchy thrived, Brits suffered. They were watching the wealthy become wealthier while they struggled to feed their families. Not much unlike today. Despite the circumstances of the times, Vivienne can't remember the family ever going without. Dora and Gordon made sure the realities of the world didn't touch their children, raising them in complete and utter bliss, until the age of 3, when for the first time ever, Vivienne experienced true jealousy. In 1944, Vivienne's sister Olga was born, and from that moment on, everything changed. The girls weren't anything alike, and Vivienne had even vowed to dead her and put her in the dustbin. A lot of people who knew Vivienne said they felt it went beyond normal sibling jealousy and contributed to Vivienne's later suspicion of women in life. As much of Vivienne's staff, who worked with her for years, never even knew she had a sister because she failed to mention her. Now, I have a sister, and I'm no stranger to sibling rivalry and jealousy, but I think all of my friends know about my sister, so I can't speak to this. And then in 1946, her brother Gordon was born. Despite the odd sibling jealousy, the Swires loved their children deeply. Dora had installed in them a confidence and dressed them in good quality clothing made at the C&A in Manchester or by her own hand. Dora was proud of her home and family and cared very deeply about their outward appearances. By all standards, she was a very present mother, motherly traits that weren't passed on to Vivienne, who never quite found her footing as the doting mother or perfect housewife, though she would try. As a young child, Vivienne struggled with her appearance, never seeing herself as pretty. She had straight brown hair and not the golden curls of Shirley Temple, and it upset her dearly that her mother dressed her in plain clothes instead of the frilly ones she dreamed of. And this could be why, at a young age, she learned how to make her own clothes and use what little money she had to buy fabrics to make clothes. The war had made everyone thrifty. Women took up knitting, sewing, and embroidery, and Dora was no exception. A talented seamstress who passed her talents on to Vivienne, who by 16 years old had learned how to craft a dress out of a single yard of fabric. That's truly a talent. She was always resourceful, and because she grew up in the countryside, the children learned everything there was to know about the outdoors. They spent their free time outside, growing up with hamsters and guinea pigs in their backyard, and making toys and games out of discarded objects. Vivienne loved the outdoors, exploring peaks and dales, and finding hideaways in the wooded terrains, wandering freely, daydreaming, and taking pleasure in solitude. The changing seasons were the panorama of her life. In the spring and summer, Vivienne and her siblings would make little gardens for the fairies in the woods, and she spent her childhood wandering the countryside. In May, her favorite month, her mother would dress them up and take them for picnics at Devil's Bridge. Dora even made sure her children had a birthday party every year, and for the summer holiday, they would always go to the seaside. Those days were spent frolicking and living a wild abandon, and the winters were just as magical. Vivienne's class would hang paper chains to decorate the classrooms, and her parents, to supplement their income, made and sold Christmas wreaths made from the holly that grew in the hedgerows. And during the holidays, the family spent their days sledding. Their father, Gordon, was known for having the best sled for miles, and the Swire family sled came to be known as the stagecoach by the neighborhood children. And while the children lived this idealistic country life, Vivienne always strayed from the pack. Interested in being knowledgeable in everything, cultivating her imagination with books, which led her beyond the restricted world of her family and the shared room she had with her siblings. She found escape in the worlds of Enid Blyton, the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, and Locke Navarre, and later Dickens, Buchanan, Chaucer, and Keats. She spent her youth analyzing the world in broader cultural terms to stimulate her mind. Books were her escape, but they were always a sublime luxury. Early on summer mornings, Vivienne would climb over the wall behind her cottage, walk through a quarry to a meadow to read, saying, "I remember sitting in this meadow in the sun with the dew still on the grass, and I could smell May blossom. And even at that early age, I remember saying to myself how lucky I was. I was born in the war years when there was rationing, and I'm ever so glad I wasn't inundated with products all around me. Things were precious, important. I loved school, and I wanted to know everything I could about the things I was reading about." Her brother Gordon said, "We were very free. No one ever told us when we had to come in. We'd just come in after dark, having been in the fields with friends." But Vivienne was too much in her books, so Mom made her throw away her library tickets. She paid her to destroy them, so she took the money, then she carried on getting books. And before anyone has any thoughts about this was just a sign of the times. Dora and Gordon were raised to work. They spent years being encouraged to make, mend, and do. Reading was a leisure activity and a privilege, and seen as a waste of time when one could be working instead. It's obvious to see why she was trying to find a way to exist outside of her confinements. She was an angsty child filled with anger, resentment, and jealousy towards her siblings and parents. She had to share a room with her siblings and was often left to watch them alone while her parents worked or went out for the evening. Typical older sibling responsibilities, but it sucks nonetheless. Vivienne would walk them to school every morning and took them to church on Sundays. Though her parents weren't very religious, the children were expected to attend Sunday school, and Vivienne found herself captivated by it. More so the stories and ideas surrounding it, remembering at the age of 4 about the crucifixion or the execution of Jesus Christ on the cross and how it marked her for life. She was never able to kick the savagery and outright unnecessariness of it, but also ashamed by her own ignorance. She felt her teachers, who had covered the story up to be more lighthearted and happy, were liars, and it made her question what else they could be hiding. She was determined to stick up for the underdog and never take what someone says at face value. As a child, she became emotionally tied to Jesus. In her eyes, being Christian would be a betrayal equal to the acceptance of his torture. And it was that day she remembered as the day she vowed to challenge oppression, saying, "I felt I had to become a freedom fighter to stop this sort of thing going on. I really did want to do something to change this horrible world." She had this innate perversity, a reaction against anything orthodox, and as she got older, she found little ways to rebel. Her first confrontation with tyranny was in nursery school, when to avoid the long line at the girls' bathroom, she used the boys', which earned her a slap across the face from her teachers. She said she used to wear one colored stocking with one white stocking as part of her school uniform, and began customizing her skirts by tightening them around the waist and cutting a slit up the back, padding her bras, longing to create the curvy female form of the women she admired, like Sophia Loren, Marilyn Monroe, and Jane Mansfield. Her love of curves is what would inspire her to challenge skinniness with voluptuous enhancements like corsets, padded hips, and high heels. And then at the age of 12, something quite memorable happened that really influenced her later work. On a rainy day, June 2nd, 1953, Vivienne and her family attended a celebration tea party, waving their Union Jacks as they watched on the television the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. This moment had a profound impact on her life, as Vivienne would go on to exploit Lizzie, both positively and negatively, in her creative life years later. By Vivienne's teenage years in the mid-50s, she was still rebelling against the norms of society, against the rock and roll times. Unlike most girls her age, Vivienne preferred the teddy boy look of capris, blazers, full skirts, and bobby socks. Her mother had instilled in her the value of quality and good taste, raised not to risk looking casual so as to not give the impression of poverty. So every outfit was complete with bags and shoes to match. Vivienne knew the limitations of her background, and whenever she went out, she aimed to dress above her social standing. And this is why I don't necessarily believe she was going around nursery school wearing mismatched socks, because her mother would never allow her to do that. Vivienne was determined to rise above, but to do that, She needed to figure out what she was going to do with her life. So Vivienne and a few friends began working odd jobs, like one at Woolsworth and then at Pickery's Cannery on the fruit conveyor belt. But then Vivienne's whole life direction changed in late 1957 at 16 years old when her father lost his job and the family made the tough decision to move to the more affluent South, where they bought a post office in Harrow, Middlesex. And it was a great culture shock to Vivienne and her siblings moving to the city. Malcolm McLaren would later say that in Cheshire, Vivienne dominated her brother and sister left and right and was very much in control of her life. But when she came to London, she lost that control. She found people unkind and easily accessible. Her northern accent marked her, and it was a tough transition for her. She was temporarily intimidated and insecure of her surroundings. But eventually, she put on her big girl pants and pulled herself together and began taking courses at the Harrow Art School. Initially, she took dressmaking classes, but hated the monotony of having to sit there and draw. She wanted to make clothes. She wanted to be hands-on. She didn't want to just sit around and draw. So she transferred to jewelry and silversmithing, where she learned to make copper bangles and silver rings. However, after only one term, she left. She didn't know how a working-class girl like herself could make a living in the art world. She felt like she needed to get a real job with real money, so she began working at the Kodak factory to earn money to pay for courses to become a typist for Pitman's. But after some time, she realized that she did not want to be a secretary, so she abandoned those plans, and at 18 years old, she went to teacher training college, where she took a 2-year course, graduated, and became a primary school teacher focused on the arts. Then in 1961, at 20 years old, Vivienne attended a town dance party where she would meet her first husband, Derek Westwood. The man whose name she kept and famously made her own. She rarely ever discusses him out of respect and loyalty to him and their son Ben. And despite everything that happened between them, the pair did manage to maintain a friendship throughout the years. But like I was saying, they met at a town dance hall after Derek was the only person there willing to dance with her. And Vivienne was instantly smitten because he was lively and such a good dancer, and he was an apprentice at the Hoover factory while studying to be a pilot, while also running dance halls, bingo halls, gigs at the Glen Ellen Ballroom, and the cinema. And as their relationship grew, Vivienne began working the door, collecting money, and helping Derek out however she could. They would spend their nights at the pub, singing and dancing and having a good time, and on paper, by all standards, Derek Westwood was the perfect guy for Vivienne. And as it happens, all of a sudden, they mutually agreed to get married. It was a complete whirlwind as neither had the time to slow down and think about this decision. And this is where everything starts to come together and fall apart all at the same time. All her life, Vivienne was raised to settle down, get married, have a family, and live that all-American dream. So she started dating Derek Westwood, and when he proposed to her, she accepted because that's all she knew. And she would say years later that she knew she didn't want to marry him, but he was really sweet and she couldn't afford to give him up. And it definitely had to make her wonder where her girlhood dreams had vanished to. She was being held down by the weight of the expectations of womanhood, pulled between the life she wanted and the life she was raised and taught to want. See, at teacher training college, Vivienne had actually met someone who would make her question everything. And that was Susan. With Vivienne saying, the idea of going to art school had been that I would like to do art and possibly be an artist, but I realized I wanted more. And then I met Susan, and just really, she was my best friend. When I arrived at teacher training college, late as usual for the first dinner, I looked around the room and I sat down next to Susan, the most glamorous and beautiful girl there. I've worked in fashion all these decades, and yet Susan, for me, is probably to this day the most beautiful girl I have ever seen. She had a wide mouth and a lovely pointed face and almond-shaped hazel-colored eyes. And she had a nobility about her and the self-irony that goes with it. I thought she was splendid, and we were immediately friends. She had this affection when she said things, and she was very witty. She'd have her head down to one side, beautifully poised with her cigarette, and she had burned her eyelashes through doing it. But what was typical of Susan was that she made a big joke of having burned her eyelashes by being perfectly poised. She knew books that were worth reading and something about the theater, and we became inseparable. She was the perfect friend, good-looking, and she was lovely, I thought, and we became great friends. But she stirred something in my head and heart. I definitely loved her. I would have done anything for her. I thought she was just great. As a young person, I was more interested in my own sex than the opposite one. Although I always liked boys, I think if I had a stronger relationship with a girl, that would have been okay. I should have. But I met Derek. And Derek took her to bars and to see comedy shows that she hated, while Susan took her to the theater to see A Man for All Seasons and The Crucible, which blew her away. Derek was nice. He was the boy she was taught to love, to marry, to settle down with, but he didn't do anything to cultivate her mind or make her feel alive. She loved Derek, but she didn't love him. And she was torn. She had mixed feelings about everything. On one hand, her friend groups were all saying, "This is Derek and Vivienne. They're getting married." And yet, she was changing, partially due to Susan. Vivienne said, "My choices have always been intellectual. That was a different sort of decision, and it didn't work out. Derek and I were a teenage thing. It's what teenagers should do. I have great respect for him as a person, a good person. But even though I stuck with the engagement to Derek, in the end, I knew I wanted to go outside of that relationship to find other things. And for some reason, your sexual life, in those days anyway, was tied up with that. And so I did eventually fall out of love with him. It's so obvious now. Nowadays, you can live with somebody. And at the time, maybe I was frightened to hurt Derek, but I was more interested in my girlfriend Susan because she was intellectual and I just adored her, really. Put it like this, if I had to go and live on a desert island, I would have gone with her. And I don't want to spell this out particularly, but there is something else I should explain about me and about then regarding boys and men. Up until then, until I married Derek, I would have to say I'd always cared about my girlfriends more than any bloke I went out with. That's what I wanted. Thinking back, the closeness and complicity of a woman, a soulmate, Susan cultivated Vivienne's mind and brought her into a world she didn't know. There was a stimulation to that relationship, her first intelligent friend. Up until her marriage with Derek, Vivienne cared more about her girlfriends, and Susan was her whole emotional world. With Vivienne saying, "People misunderstand," the fact was that was where I felt alive and understood. And then Susan got a job in Canada after teacher training, and that was that. I do think my mom should have known, and if only my mother had thought of suggesting an adventure away, teaching in Canada, I don't know, I would have gone like a shot. That's something that I could have done and not hurt anybody's feelings. I wish my mother had talked to me a bit more about it, or had the sense to say, "Why don't you get a job in Canada with Susan for a year, and then come back, and then see how you feel about Derek?" That would have been perfect, and would have saved everyone a lot of pain. But then again, I wouldn't have been. And once Susan left, Vivienne rushed her marriage with Derek. At the insistence of her mother, they had a formal wedding, and Vivienne made her own wedding dress. They married July 1962, and for a while they were happy. Vivienne even got pregnant, and on September 3rd, 1963, their son Benjamin was born. But then things started to change. At 21 years old, Vivienne had lost her faith in God. Her brother's girlfriend had been living with them for some time, and she had punctured Vivienne's political naivete. She opposed the Vietnam War and refused to stand for the national anthem. She was American. She even questioned Vivienne's stance on religion, and as soon as Vivienne acknowledged her beliefs were held up by her emotional commitment formed on an idea as a child, everything collapsed in front of her. The question then became, if you marry young and your passions diverge, is it right to end things? And the answer is always yes. Vivienne had explored the role of matriarch, and she just didn't fit into it. She wanted to get out and explore. She resented being stuck at home, not growing or learning, while her siblings grew up and went on to live exciting lives. Gordon was attending the Harrow Art School and living out his dreams. Vivienne definitely felt like she was missing out. She wanted out of her marriage and her life. So there were several instances where Vivienne would leave Derek to go stay with her parents, but she would always go back to him. But then in 1965, not to the shock of anyone, Vivienne left. But this time she didn't come back. Derek pleaded with her, but she ignored those pleas, and she took their 3-year-old son Ben to live with her parents. Despite the hurt Vivienne caused, her and Derek remained loyal to one another. Derek remained in Ben's life, and as Vivienne's popularity and celebrity grew throughout the decades, he never said anything to the public. And Vivienne held his privacy safe throughout her career and life, never wanting to hurt him any more than she had upon leaving him. It definitely wasn't an easy decision for her to leave, but she knew she had to do it. And after moving into her parents' flat, Vivienne would meet the man who would change the course of her life forever. Her brother Gordon, who still lived at home, would often bring friends around to hang out, and one of those friends was Malcolm McLaren, would go on to sweep Vivienne away from the conformity of her comfortable life forever, with Vivienne saying, "I was a coin, and he showed me the other side," and that he did. When I met Malcolm and I fell in love, I thought he was beautiful, and I still do. I still treasure the experience of Malcolm. A world without Malcolm would have been like a world without Brazil. He was charismatic, talented, I really liked him, and even though he was crazy, I knew I wanted to find out more about him.
I remember Malcolm turning up. I sort of remember my mother and Malcolm from when I was about 5. I remember we used to live in a flat in the Oval near the cricket ground, and Malcolm was very hot-headed and quite young, and he didn't want children around, and he didn't have much patience for us.
He came from a Jewish family. They knew the world.
And I'm going to say this now, before we begin, that Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood's relationship was horribly toxic. Emotionally, verbally, mentally, physically, and I'm going to be talking about it. So if these are things you're not comfortable with, I do suggest clicking off this video because it's definitely not for you. We really do have to delve into their relationship to fully understand everything. There is no getting around the relationship of Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren. Even her brother Gordon said Vivienne was very, very influenced by Malcolm. He changed her life. No matter what else you might say about Malcolm, he changed lives. He changed my life. He certainly changed Vivienne's. He probably changed the lives of everyone he came into contact with. Malcolm Robert Andrew McLaren was born January 1946, and at 2 years old, his parents divorced because of his mother's affairs. At 6 years old, his mother remarried, and at his stepfather's insistence, her children adopted the last name Edwards. But Malcolm loathed his stepfather and felt betrayed by his mother, who was always working or out with her various lovers. So that is why in 1971, at 25 years old, he changed his surname back to that of his father, Peter McLaren, because he wanted nothing to do with his mother or stepfather. Ultimately, it was the love he never received from his mother that became the root of his troubles. With his mother never around, Malcolm and his brother were raised by their grandmother, Rose, who took a liking to Malcolm. She let him do anything that wasn't boring. Her motto was, if you were bad, you were good, and if you were good, you were boring. So from a very young age, Malcolm was encouraged to defy authority and get into trouble because his grandmother, who clearly had issues, loved it. This childhood created a very fractured view of love and relationships, with his son Joseph saying Malcolm never knew real maternal love as a child, which was the root of all his troubles. Well, his mother rejected him, and Rose was fucking insane. And Malcolm even later said, the effect of growing up in a family that never wanted to be a family is that it is very, very difficult for you to behave in a normal way.
You know, my father was a bit more bulletproof in some respects. I mean, he kind of took that as par for the course. But for him, he was a guy who sort of never stopped running in a way. He always wanted to have a new idea, always onto some kind of new thing. And that's, to me, was a sort of nervousness and on his part of ever being able to kind of sit still and be questioned about anything. As long as he could keep moving, he never had to really face much.
And I want us to remember this little chunk of moment, because as we talk about Malcolm and Vivienne, you're going to be like, what's wrong with this dude? This is what's wrong with him. He never had anybody in his life to tell him, this is not how you act. This is not how you behave. Women are not to get you. He didn't have that. He didn't have a normal, solid foundation for a childhood. And this made him very pessimistic about everything. He came to enjoy witnessing marital conflicts. In fact, he first knew of Vivienne in 1965 when she was working at the Railway Hotel with Derek. Malcolm went to the lounge on various occasions and enjoyed witnessing Vivienne's snide remarks and rude comments directed at Derek. He truly got off on chaos, and you will see that as we continue. But despite knowing who Vivienne was at this time, he never spoke a word to her, and Vivienne never knew of his existence until she left Derek and moved home. Malcolm was Gordon's friend. with Gordon saying, just being alongside him, you would realize how possible the world is. He never really lived in reality himself. He showed Vivienne what was possible and allowed her to dream, and no matter what happened later, that is the greatest gift you can give anybody. By the time Gordon met Malcolm, Malcolm didn't really have anywhere to live, so Gordon tried bringing him to his parents' flat above the post office, but their parents hated him and actually banned him from the house. So Gordon, feeling bad, let Malcolm sleep inside his car outside the post office, and when their parents would leave, Vivienne would help sneak him upstairs to shower and have some breakfast. At this point, Vivienne just felt bad for the guy. She didn't have a crush on him or any romantic feelings towards him whatsoever. That would come after Gordon moved out of the family's flat and rented a house on King's Avenue in South London. That was when Malcolm moved in with him, and very soon after, Vivienne and Ben moved into the flat as well. There she began creating her own jewelry, which she sold in a stall on Portobello Road. She did most of her work at Gordon's loft, and that is where she really got to know Malcolm. At first, he was so afraid to talk to her, he did everything to avoid her. He believed women were either unreliable like his mother or suffocatingly manipulative like his grandmother, and therefore he was unwilling to befriend any woman, let alone be near them. Vivienne, on the other hand, liked his attitude and was amused by his fiery temper, but she wasn't physically attracted to him, as he wasn't conventionally handsome and she liked pretty boys. Malcolm had thin ginger hair and a red face that he often tried to disguise with talcum powder, which earned him the nickname Talky Malky, which is just horrible. Slowly, the pair began to bond through smoking and talking while Vivienne worked on her jewelry, and her indifference towards him broke down over time. As he began to help her make the jewelry, Vivienne became intrigued by the way Malcolm would put the beads together and make them look less boring. And he was attracted to the way she seemed to hang on to his every word, with Vivienne saying, "He made your world seem livelier just by being Malcolm. Malcolm chased me. I didn't want him. I didn't want him for a boyfriend. I liked him tremendously. He was vital, shocking, informed, and he was such fun to be with, and I felt sorry for him." They talked about anything and everything, and soon Vivienne began to seek his company because she was impressed by how cultured he was. He would lecture her on the political power of art and the appeal of cult fashions, and it was during this time their roles were established. Vivienne the student craftsman and Malcolm the opinionated art director, with Vivienne saying, "I felt there were so many doors to open and he had the keys to all of them. Plus he had a political attitude and I needed to align myself." Eventually they would sleep together after Malcolm came up with the ruse that he was sick and needed to sleep in her bed. And I don't know, honestly, this information felt like none of my business, but it is important to their story because while I believe virginity is a social construct, for Malcolm this was his first time, and losing his virginity unsettled him greatly. He became possessive of her, and if he saw her having tea or talking to another man, he would become enraged. He became obsessed. Vivienne, though, wasn't so attached to him, but with time she would be. Within weeks, she found out she was pregnant, and his attitude changed drastically, completely, and immediately. Malcolm went from being overly possessive and jealous to claiming Vivienne duped him into thinking she was on birth control. The whole situation distressed him, and because Vivienne wasn't so attached, she brought up the idea of an abortion. Though illegal in 1967, Malcolm's grandmother, who hated Vivienne, was more than glad to pay for the abortion. And at first, Vivienne agreed, but on the day of the procedure with the money in hand on the porch of the doctor's house, Vivienne decided that she didn't want to go through with it, and instead, she went and bought some new clothes. Her thought process on this was that she felt she had misled Malcolm and now felt obligated to be involved in his life.
When I had Joe, I wanted to have an abortion and I really wasn't happy at all. And one day I suddenly realised this man is gold. What am I doing?
Saying, "I looked at Malcolm and I suddenly realized, what are you doing? I thought, he's amazing. He's such a fantastic person. You'll never meet anybody like him. What are you doing? He's not your type of whatever, no, but he's just fantastic." And I just completely changed. And when she informed Malcolm that she didn't go through with the abortion, he did not take it well. He felt like she trapped him, and he warned her that he would bear no responsibilities for this child. And I do want to mention that I do not know the whole situation, only they do, but as much as Vivienne said she wasn't attached to Malcolm, I think a part of her felt like she needed him to gain more knowledge, to become cultured, to learn about the world, and align herself with things that were important. And she never asked him to be a father, pay for school, or give child support. But the two would go on to have an entire relationship through the course of their son's life, which had to be very confusing and traumatic. Malcolm could have left her, right then and there, but he didn't. And Vivienne could have left him, but she didn't. These two didn't walk away from each other, despite how detrimental their relationship would be on each other and her sons, Ben and Joe. With Ben saying, "I lived on and off with Malcolm for 15 years from age 3. In all that time, it was always clear to me that he would rather be on his own with my mother without having me or my half-brother around. And from the stories I'm going to tell, this seems true for both of them." While there's no doubt in my mind that Vivienne loved her sons, she definitely lived like she didn't have any. But this story isn't about her sons, so I'm not going to dig into their lives. And I do want to make it known, like right now, that this is a story, a compilation of books, interviews, and magazines. And for the most part, I've just tried to compile everyone's tellings of the facts. But it's difficult because those two were very contradictory about their relationship, their feelings towards one another, and of their careers. We've seen it already when Vivienne said that she wasn't attached to Malcolm, so she was more than willing to have the abortion. And then a few days later, she was like, "No, this dude is amazing. I need to have his baby, and I need to be with him." And we will see that with Malcolm, who undercuts her contributions to their work. Both have various tellings of the truth. So we have Vivienne's side, and we have some of Malcolm's side, and somewhere in the middle of all of that lies the actual truth. So just keep that in mind. After Vivienne's decision not to have the abortion, despite being alarmed about becoming a father, Malcolm became obsessed yet again. With Vivienne saying, unfortunately, by that time, almost immediately, he really lost his amour for me to some quite large extent. So we didn't start off very well, and apart from that, he then got alarmed at this idea of being sucked into being a family man. But nevertheless, he could be crazy in a good way. He wanted me there all the time. Like once after a doctor's appointment, Vivienne went to pick up Ben from nursery and was late getting home when she found Malcolm running up and down the streets in hysterics with a look of despair on his face because he thought she left him. Their relationship is full of contradictions. I'm giving you what I have. Take from it what you will. Their son, Joe, said their victory, Mom and Malcolm, was that they found each other. No matter what happened later, you have to give it to them. They changed everything, and it's difficult to say who inspired who. One thing for sure, while their relationship doesn't make much sense, one of the best things to come from their relationship outside of their son was their involvement in fashion. Malcolm had been obsessed with fashion, and he was the person who got Vivienne interested in fashion. He was a true genius at channeling his childhood anger into movements that incited chaos, and Vivienne was intrigued by his anarchistic visions as they provided an outlet for her indignation about the world. She didn't necessarily love his rants for revolution, but she believed in him. Once she committed herself to being with Malcolm, that's all that mattered. She saw him differently. She wanted him to be the best he could be and was going to help him however she could. He introduced her to John Berger, the Marxist art critic, and Buenaventura Durruti, the anarchist who blew up buildings. And she listened to his every word, saying, "I began to think he was very brave. Now I'm not so sure. I don't know whether he was that brave." Malcolm became more talkative the later the hour, and his favorite subject was himself. I was really worn out, and Malcolm led his life at college being an art student and came home not necessarily every night, but she was nothing if not loyal. While Malcolm was off at school running his mouth, Vivienne provided. She taught and worked selling her jewelry until November 30th, 1967, when her son Joseph Correa was born. Now Malcolm's grandmother convinced him not to attend the birth, so he showed up 6 days later, and instead of putting McLaren, Edwards, or Swire on the birth certificate, the pair decided to give Joseph the last name of Malcolm's great-grandmother, Correa. Malcolm maybe did this to distance himself from Joseph, but I also read somewhere that it was like family tradition to give their children a different last name than the one they had. So I don't know. And as Joseph grew up, Malcolm, a constant presence in his life, refused to be called Dad and would brush Joseph off whenever he could. Soon after giving birth, Vivienne went back to work to support her children. At one point, Vivienne was really struggling. On multiple occasions, she almost lost her job because she was constantly late as she had to drop Joe off at nursery. She even asked Malcolm for help, but he refused since it was her decision to keep Joe. And if she were to ask him for help, he would say, "You can give him to me, but if you do, I'll take him straight to Dr. Bernardo's." And she knew he would. Now you might be wondering who Dr. Bernardo is. He is the founder and director of an orphanage. So Malcolm was basically telling her if she wanted his help, he would take Joe to an orphanage. And you're probably wondering, why did she stay with him? And honestly, it's not my place to judge, but here's what Vivienne had to say. I know people will think this is mad, but that's how it was. Malcolm was horrible at that time, and he reserved a special horrible for anybody who was a mother. He hated my relationship with my children. even his own son, even Joe. He always pretended that he wasn't Joe's father at all, so though it may seem that Malcolm was a bastard because he wouldn't help, that was the extent of his bad treatment. And my position was simple. It was about commitment. I loved him. I believed in him. I could learn from him. My children could benefit in the long run. And still, sometimes he would organize very creative things for the boys to do. And I think it's because simply I valued so much what I could learn from Malcolm. I think what I want to say is this. I know people will think I was a doormat because I put up with his cavalier attitude to me and the boys, but I knew at the same time how much he depended on me. I told myself so. He needed me. I needed him for what he knew, and he needed me because someone had to need him. And I could talk to him, and I could develop by talking to him. Ideas are more important than everything, don't you see? So I stayed with him. I would stand for anything with Malcolm because I'd committed myself to him. But while Vivienne committed herself fully to Malcolm, Malcolm was committing himself to La Société du Spectacle. In 1967, radical ideology was spreading across Europe, and students were becoming enthralled by the Situationist International and their publication La Société du Spectacle, based on Guy Debord's Situationist International, which was founded in Italy in 1957, and which declared that artists should break down the barriers between life and art and act as agents of provocateur, creating ridiculous situations in urban environments as a nihilist reaction to the status quo, and to evade the commercialization of the former. They believed every aspect of capitalistic life had been reduced to a commodity, and they fused this belief with Dadaism, Surrealism, and the unrestrained hedonism of the time. This was the beginning of the resistance. Malcolm became a part of the movement, once dressing up as Father Christmas along with other students and storming Carrot's toy store the month after Joe was born. And in June 1969, the group barricaded themselves in the Croydon College of Art and Design, chanting, "Demand the impossible," and demanding ridiculous things like being allowed to sculpt in pure gold. It was more fun to revolt than to study, so self-indulgence and idealism underpinned many students' cries for a revolution. And Malcolm was a part of that problem. While most were fighting for a true cause, Malcolm's goal was to create chaos. He traveled around Europe to various places trying to instigate revolts and uprisings, and Malcolm would always send Vivienne postcards telling her about the things he was doing and begging her to come out and visit him. And at one point, she went. By this point, she had fallen head over heels for him, with one friend and former employee saying, "When she falls, she really falls." She really loved him, and she talked about that holiday so romantically. Every little thing about Malcolm impressed her. And before leaving, Malcolm asked her to design t-shirts for the Paris riots in the left bank that had slogans that Malcolm had heard during his travels, like, "Be reasonable, demand the impossible," "Under the paving stones lies the beach," and "It is forbidden to forbid." These were the first t-shirts that they made together. And after she made the shirts, she dropped her 2 sons off at her parents' and went to frolic around Europe with Malcolm in a tent for a month. And while it was a month of pure bliss, upon her return, Vivienne found that her son, Joseph, had slipped into an almost catatonic state and wouldn't respond to her. He only responded hours later after Malcolm managed to make him smile. Joseph had been so traumatized by her absence that he shut down emotionally. Vivienne believed this was because she had let him down by abandoning him for almost a month. And I mean, yeah, he was literally a baby. But Vivienne swore she was done and she would never leave him again. So the next day she went to work, handed in her notice, and left immediately to look after her children. She probably should have just left Malcolm, but instead she quit her job, and Malcolm, not shockingly, fully supported her decision to leave her job because he thought it meant she would have more time to spend with him. And now there was no income whatsoever between them, and they couldn't afford their lease, so they were forced to move out. And Malcolm went to live with his grandma Rose, who refused to house Vivienne and her sons, so Vivienne moved back home. The distance and Malcolm's lack of commitment to their relationship left them in limbo. Malcolm very rarely visited Vivienne at her parents' house because they hated each other. On one visit, Malcolm saw them walking up to the house, and to avoid confrontation, he literally jumped out the window. Sometimes he would visit her under the pretense of breaking up with her so that he could be free to fall in love with another student who could live a free student life with him in London. He didn't want to be shackled to a working-class single mother living with her parents in the country. But Malcolm would often change his mind about breaking up with her because he loved how she listened to him and how much she wanted to be with him. He loved being loved, but he was incredibly cruel, often taunting her with tales of infidelity. Like Helen, a soldier he met in his campaign to wreak havoc through art. The two began an affair because Malcolm was intrigued by her very short stature and partially to rub it in Vivienne's face. telling her about his escapades, saying, "Helen is plain, but she's more interesting than you." And an artist needs to experiment and be free, and neither relationship nor children should stand in the way of their destiny. What a douchebag. During their limbo period, Malcolm would actually get married to Joyce Hakim so that she could remain in Britain. And by all accounts, this was just a visa thing. She paid him £50 to marry her, and while it wasn't a real marriage, Vivienne was deflated. By this point, Vivienne was willing to do anything and everything to reconcile and hold on to Malcolm. So she left home because Malcolm often told her the reason he didn't visit more was because she lived at home and he hated her parents. So she left home and strained her relationship with her mother for over a decade. Now, mind you, Vivienne still didn't have a job or any income or savings of any kind, but her family did have a caravan, and that is what she moved her and her children into. She fed them dandelion roots and homeschooled them, conducting lessons in museums, markets, beaches, and the hedgerows, where she taught them botany and art. And even though she was struggling, Malcolm came around more because he felt more at ease sketching while watching Vivienne play with her sons. And while he has memories of this time as beautiful and blissful, her son Ben remembers Malcolm's visits as being awful because he knew Malcolm didn't like him. And Malcolm literally went around trying to convince Vivienne that Ben was stupid and a sniveling little brat. And he also undermined his father, Derek Westwood, dismissing Ben as an offspring of a no-hoper, saying things like, "Joseph is a part of me, and Ben's a part of someone she never had any respect for." So Malcolm was telling his friends that he got back with Vivienne for Joe's sake, so that he didn't grow up in a narrow working-class way like Vivienne had. But none of this seemed to matter to Vivienne. She was so in love with Malcolm by this point that he could do no wrong. She wanted to disappear into the world she created with him. Eventually, in 1970, Malcolm found them a place on Nightingale Lane in London where they would live on and off for over a decade. Though Malcolm got the place, Vivienne went back to teaching because they needed to pay rent, and she needed to support and feed her children. But she was happy. Like I said, all she wanted to do was disappear into a world with Malcolm. That is until Malcolm made it very clear her sons were part of the problem. If he came home late and found the boys in their bed, he would fly into a rage and demand the boys go back to their beds. By this point, it was becoming obvious that Vivienne's sons were an inconvenience. Then Malcolm came up with the idea of boarding school. At 10 years old, Ben was sent to boarding school, so was 4-year-old Joe. Malcolm said he sent them off to be politicized so they could flourish in a fascist state, but it was really to get them gone. And Vivienne went along with it. Her love for Malcolm was obsessive, and his disregard for her children made them invisible in her world. And yes, it gets worse. So Vivienne and Malcolm could barely afford their rent, so how did they pay for boarding school? They didn't. They would just send the boys off, keep them there until all the goodwill was used up, and then pick them up in the middle of the night and send them to another school, over and over and over again. And this hurts my heart because I truly don't want to sit here and bash Vivienne or Malcolm, but they suck. And I feel bad for those boys because they really stand up and defend their mother like they should, but it had to be incredibly cruel to have to go through all of this. And they had to witness their marital fights. Malcolm was verbally abusive and Vivienne was physically abusive. There were many times that Vivienne threw Malcolm out and he would have to climb up the drain pipe just to get back into their apartment. And another time, during one of their breakups, Vivienne went into a fury when she found out that Malcolm had a girlfriend living with him, so she went to his place, made sure he was home, and then threw a brick through his front window. And I will talk about this in part 3, but there was also a point where Malcolm couldn't start his day or leave the house until he made Vivienne cry. They were horribly cruel to each other. But people often said that Vivienne loved to taunt him, get him annoyed with her, and then she would feed off the violence and chaos that ensued. But Malcolm equally loved and did just the same thing. And we will talk about this probably more in part 3, but yeah, they weren't great. But her sons had to see all of this. Ben even said one thing that wasn't perfect was that Malcolm was her number one. Outside of Joseph, the only good thing to come from the couple's relationship was the fashion. Malcolm opened the door to Vivienne's career in fashion by taking her to King's Road and dressing her up. By the late 60s and early 70s, the hippie movement dominated London, and both Vivienne and Malcolm vehemently hated the hippie movement and instead adopted a more sectarian dress. the uniforms of the 50s Teddy Boy revival to distinguish themselves from the hippie creed and reflect their passion for 50s rock and roll. They wore Teddy Boy draped jackets, drain pipes, circle skirts, and cardigans. Vivienne's previous love of drawing attention to herself through dress was emboldened by Malcolm, and their clothes quickly allied to the roots of rock and roll, and this was the beginning of everything. And I mean everything. In 1971, Malcolm finally graduated college and plunged into a deep, dark depression, literally painting the halls and floors of their apartment black, like a hole of despair. He needed money, and he had no ambition to enter the corporate world or even mainstream fashion. Music was his real passion, so he decided to sell his collection of old 45s and rock and roll memorabilia in a stall. And while on a random walk, Malcolm turned on 430 Kings Road, passing Paradise Garage, when the man inside yelled to Malcolm about liking his outfit. The two struck up a conversation, and Malcolm told this guy of his plans to find a space to sell his collection of 45s and memorabilia, and for some reason, the man just decided to give Malcolm the back half of the store. And then, after a few months, out of sheer dumb luck or fate, Malcolm got the entire shop to himself. The place became his, and then he began scouring London for pieces to fill the store with. Together, the pair decided to rename it Let It Rock, and would change the name of the shop with every collection. Let It Rock started out selling 60s records, as that sort of music wasn't available anywhere, not even on the radio. Slowly, it became a second wave of Teddy Boys, a British subculture of teens in the 50s who were interested in rock and roll and Edwardian-style dressing. Very soon, Let It Rock was selling all things rock and roll, including all the authentic Teddy Boy clothing they could get their hands on. Malcolm ran the shop, while Vivienne worked 2 jobs. During the day, she was a primary school teacher, and by the afternoon, she was working at the shop repairing and altering the original pieces that needed mending. She was what distinguished Let It Rock from the other rock and roll shops that popped up in London. She worked restoring the original pieces into pristine condition, repairing the linings, replacing buttons with authentic originals, and even having them dry cleaned. Customers came for the high-quality work being done at the shop and bought up their entire stock. So Malcolm asked Vivienne to leave her teaching job to work full-time at the store, making direct copies and replicas of the original Teddy Boy pieces they sold. So she began methodically duplicating the originals to a T, working tirelessly to repair, alter, and copy the clothing, picking them apart and putting them back together. She was self-taught, but her work was perfection. Malcolm became the face of the store while Vivienne worked in the back. And for years, when talking to the press, Malcolm gave the impression that he was the only one involved with the shop. Vivienne didn't exist, despite the huge commitment and her work's popularity. With Malcolm saying, "Fashion was in my blood, especially in menswear. My grandparents were tailors. I was a dedicated follower of fashion, just like Ray Davies of the Kinks sings, whereas Vivienne was someone who fell into it. I forced her." And like I said, Malcolm could be quite dismissive of her contributions, often keeping her under his control by picking at her insecurities, telling her she would be nothing but a factory worker if it wasn't for him. But Vivienne did say that while he might have shown her the fashion business, it became a baby I picked up and never put down. She taught herself tailoring and said that Malcolm couldn't even thread a needle. And I truly believe without Vivienne, Malcolm would have run the shop into the ground. He ran it so erratically, he would open at odd hours of the day because he enjoyed frustrating his customers by making them wait outside. And sometimes while customers were shopping, he would randomly announce that an item in their hands, whether it be a record, clothing, or memorabilia, was actually a collector's item and not for sale, just to mess with them. He thrived on chaos, and that chaotic energy seeped through Vivienne's pores. After the shop opened in 1971, Vivienne did something drastic, something memorable, something truly iconic. Persuaded by Malcolm, she cut her long hair into a cropped, ragged look, and then razored it into layers down the back of her neck and bleached it. Coupe Sauvage, as it came to be known, was full of aggression and soon became the hallmark hairstyle of the punk movement. Simon Barker of Bromley contingent believes David Bowie and his ex-wife Angie copied Vivienne's look very early on, just before Ziggy Stardust came out in 1972. In 1973, after a year or so of running Let It Rock, the Teddy Boy concept began to bore contempt from Vivienne, who became disgusted when she learned about the 1958 Notting Hill race riots. The Teddy Boy racists and sexists who went around Notting Hill hunting people of color and beating them up or killing them. You know, just your typical group of rambunctious youths going around beating and killing people of color for fun. Vivienne said she was outraged and immediately made Malcolm shut the store down, closing Let It Rock to the shock of everyone around them who had been making a living off the repopularized 50s Teddy Boy rock and roll era. It was like their biggest rival just shut down one day out of nowhere. And after they closed, Vivienne and Malcolm vowed never to be mainstream again and allied themselves as outlaws against the establishment. They didn't want to sell the same thing as anyone else, and they never would again. And this is the last time I'm going to say it, but remember what I said about having her side of the story and having Malcolm's side of the story? Vivienne's side of the story for why Let It Rock closed was that she was outraged by the Notting Hill race riots when she learned about them, but she was of age at that time, so I don't know how she didn't know about them. And Malcolm said that they closed Let It Rock because I was bored with it all. Bored with the same surrogate suburban teddy boys that drifted in from God knows where. Bored with the hippies and refugees of Chelsea's swinging 60s looking for charity and kindness. Bored with the demands of the BBC wardrobe department and their dreadful revivalist TV shows. I was lost in dead tissue. I wanted something new. Again, somewhere between her version of closing Let It Rock and his version of closing Let It Rock lies the truth. I'm not sure exactly whose version is closer to the truth, but you can decide that for yourself. They reopened the shop as Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die in tribute to James Dean's untimely passing. Images from Rebel Without a Cause and Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising were their inspiration. The work now included studded miniskirts, biker leathers, chains, motorcycle memorabilia, and oil-stained Levi's. There were ball and chain zippers on shirts, patent leather stilettos, and mohair jumpers. The looks were rough and confrontational and would come to be worn by much of the growing gay community of the time. It was at Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die that the pair began printing t-shirts and were some of the first to fully exploit the t-shirt, the affordable statement of defiance that would become anti-fashion in its simplest form. The shape of the t-shirts were simple and beautiful. They became a canvas with the core design serving as a tool of propaganda and a call for rebellion. Their subversive designs attracted youthful buyers, bore the shock and offense they caused the public. They were instructions to society, each carrying a direct message. The first few shirts were meek in design, but soon they began adding marble feathers and tiny see-through plastic windows with a cigarette card, with a pinup girl or rock idol. She sewed zippers to the chest, which opened and allowed the nipples to peek through. She even used chicken bones that she got from a restaurant, that she boiled down and drilled holes into, and that she sewed onto shirts to spell out words like perv, rock, sex, and more. They would go on to also create a Venus t-shirt that had horsehair, metal studs, and bike tire sleeves.
As far as I remember, at one point, this was put into a photo frame on the wall, and Sid Vicious came in one day, smashed the glass and took this off. I worked with Malcolm, on these. It was his idea to put the bike tire on the shoulders.
Customers were thrilled by the zeal of the clothing. One French designer and motorcycle enthusiast in particular was enamored. Jean-Charles de Castelbajac was so taken by the juxtaposition, he left a note for Vivienne and Malcolm that read, "I love the things you do. I think we have some common interests, and I would love to meet you." On the experience, he said, "When I met Malcolm and Vivienne, it was a strange day. It was January 1972. It was pouring rain. I found this little shop called Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die in Kings Road in London. In the window were all these t-shirts, and the t-shirts had these chicken bones sewed on, and they spelled out things like rock and roll and sex. So I said, these people, they are my brothers. We were appropriating things and hijacking like pirates. We became lifelong friends." The pair worked at Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die, where they honed their DIY approach to fashion. In August 1973, Vivienne and Malcolm flew to New York to sell their work at a boutique fair, and it was there they met Alice Cooper and Sylvain Sylvain of the New York Dolls, who convinced them to come to the Chelsea Hotel, where they introduced them to the heart of the New York rock scene, surrounded by narcissistic hedonism, bent on experimenting with the derangement of senses. They were interviewed by Andy Warhol, they clubbed at CBGB's, they saw Richard Hell, the Ramones, and Patti Smith. And this is where Malcolm became fixated on the New York Dolls and Richard Hell. Hell was unkempt, degenerate, with a shag cut, and who wore safety pin clothing. For Malcolm, it was here he fully grasped the potential of the disaffected youth market, something he would use to fuel the punk movement back home in London. Upon the couple's return to London, economic and social gloom had settled in. England was in crisis. Prime Minister Edward Heath had called for an election on the single issue of who governs Britain, and the resounding response was, "Not you." Industrial tensions escalated into strikes and power shortages. An anti-authoritarian political climate ensued, and Malcolm wanted to turn up the heat. The next generation of youth were angry, obviously foreshadowing what was to come. And while the tides were slowly turning, Vivienne was trying to do everything she could to keep the store open and running, while Malcolm was running around seeking affairs with employees and taking entire days off, only to return home to Vivienne at night after she spent the entire day running the store. His affairs really pushed her over the edge and made her suspicious of all women, seeing them as sexual rivals. Vivienne even went as far as to accompany Malcolm when he went out at night, just to make sure he didn't flirt with anyone or go home with another woman. They just weren't in a good place. But by November 1973, things were changing. Malcolm was looking for more, and he found that when the New York Dolls arrived in London. The glam rock band from New York, who were known for bending gender lines, wearing women's clothing and heels while playing rock music. They feigned sexual ambivalence and debunked the macho rock star image of success and sexuality. Malcolm was goo-goo for them, intoxicated by their raw power. He went to every single one of their shows and was captivated and confronted by the lines of fashion and sexuality. London had never seen anything like the New York Dolls, who bridged androgyny with glam rock and what would later be called punk. Alongside Richard Hell, their style became the foundation for the London punk movement as we know it. In New York, Malcolm had witnessed the extremes of the permissive society, with David Bowie flaunting his bisexuality, and this growing liberalization set the scene for Malcolm, who knew the one thing that would antagonize the sexually repressed English was sexual fetish wear. So Malcolm and Vivienne closed Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die and refocused their efforts. Both fans of the New York Dolls, they became intrigued by the growing liberalization of society and the dangers that came with it. They wanted to push things further, to antagonize and confront the sexually repressed English establishment using fetish wear. So Vivienne did a lot of research and became enthralled with it, saying, I had to ask myself why this extreme form of dress. Not that I strapped myself up and had sex like that, but on the other hand, I also didn't want to liberally understand why people did it. I wanted to get a hold of those extreme articles of clothing and feel what it was like to wear them. And in late summer 1974, they reopened the shop under the name Sex, spelled out in flesh pink letters cut from padded PVC like a pop art sculpture. Their slogan for customers was, "Pornography is the laughter of the bathroom of your mind." Much of Sex's imagery resembled the work of 50s artist Eric Stanton, who produced drawings of comics of women in black leather and bondage gear, as well as the American director Russ Metter, whose films Super Vixen and Beyond the Valley of the Dolls were crammed with camp essence. Inside the store was a sexual romper room filled with sheets of elastoplastic pink surgical rubber that was said to be soft and powdery to the touch like a condom. There was French lingerie in black and red, scissored open for easy access, displayed next to whips, chains, nipple clamps, handcuffs, rubber eyeless masks, and studded zipped masks. It was at Sex where Vivienne began to deconstruct and reconstruct her infamous t-shirts. She would cut off the sleeves, rip up the shoulder seams, and sew them back together. Sometimes her new t-shirts could take up to 3 days to design. The looks were largely incohesive, but were a precursor to punk, which was a singularly asexual style that defined a lot of people's lives. Sex customers included a mix of everyone from young and old, religious and non-religious. Sex was shockingly provocative, in a lot of good ways, but also in some bad ways, like one t-shirt that bore an image of a naked black man and another shirt that featured a prepubescent boy that came as a response to the BBC documentary Johnny Go Home, about a teenager who ran away to London and worked as a rent boy. Now, the shirts are disgusting, and I'm not going to show them here, and I don't suggest that you look them up either. I did link the documentary. I did manage to find it. I haven't watched it yet, but a lot of articles say that it's good, so if you are interested in seeing it, I have linked it, but we're going to move on. Her deconstruction of the t-shirt was an attack on the capitalistic modes of production and consumption. Customers would soon be instructed to live up to the DIY ethos and rhetoric painted on their chest and arms. The markings of punk would come to include a violent rejection of prettiness and naturalness and had a cacophony of clashing visual references. They just had no idea what they were about to do for the world of asexuals, gays, theys, and the sexually unsure who didn't have a place to go. And while this was a refuge for them, for Vivienne and Malcolm, the shop was just created to annoy the British by attacking sexual attitudes, undermining the Puritan and primitive basis of their culture, to turn S&M gear into a defiant fashion by removing it from the bedroom, flaunting it in public, robbing it of its erotic mystery, and turning it into combat gear for a sexually liberal army. For many others, this was a place to explore who they were and who they wanted to be without judgment. And at the same time, the Sex Pistols were forming under the name The Strand, which included Paul Cook, Glenn Matlock, and Steve Jones. And at the same time, Steve Jones was sharing bunk beds with Vivienne's sons, and it was then he began begging Malcolm to manage his band, which Malcolm turned down. But things were brewing. Before Malcolm would go on to manage the Sex Pistols, he would go to New York and he set his sights on managing the New York Dolls. But before he did that, him and Vivienne created one of the first pre-punk sex t-shirts, a tribal manifesto, called "You're Gonna Wake Up One Morning and Know What Side of the Bed You've Been Lying On." It took form in a t-shirt and pointed the way to the future, inspired by the 1967 Scum Manifesto by Valerie Solanas. Her radical manifesto, Scum, or Society for Cutting Up Men, covered the walls of sex and thus became the inspiration behind Vivienne and Malcolm's manifesto. Solanas' manifesto argued that men ruin the world and it was up to women to fix it. It talked about how we women needed to overthrow society and eliminate the male sex, saying, life in this society being at best an utter bore, and no aspect of society being at all relevant to women, there remains to civic-minded, responsible, thrill-seeking females only to overthrow the government, eliminate the money system, institute complex automation, and destroy the male. It wasn't a well-known manifesto until Solanas attempted to murder Andy Warhol in 1968. But Vivienne and Malcolm took from this manifesto and made it their own. Their manifesto contained two lists, blessed and blasted. The blasted included the fashionable establishment, the law, the lazy, and inert in all forms of commercial and passively received entertainment, while the blessed included rockers, sexual adventurers, rebels, renegades, and embraced the DIY ethos. And one important fact to mention here is that this shirt is the first mention of the band that would go on to shape punk as we know it, Cuddy Jones and his Sex Pistols. It said Malcolm got the name Sex Pistols from an American gang, but I don't know how true that is. But what I do know is that this truly was the beginning. Sex became the pre-punk ethos created as an anti-authoritarian stand against the government. Nihilism led to anti-design, anti-fashion, anti-social, and anti-establishment. It was very much a we hate everything and everyone kind of vibe. In Vivienne's own words, punk was a direct reaction to the people who caused the Vietnam War, who still ruled, who ruined their world, and now no one was going to accept them or their taboos anymore. Sex took the deviant S&M fashion, made it public, stripped it of its mystery, and turned it into gear for a sexually liberated youth army. Seditionaries and punk really were just a continuation of Malcolm and Vivienne's commercial exploitation of street culture and its fusion of rock and roll, teddy boy, mod, Rastafarian culture, and protest. With Vivienne saying, punk was a great stand against authority. Where did all those things come from? They came from culture. The motives for being anti-establishment were already in the culture when Malcolm and I first started to do clothes before punk rock. We were looking at our lifetime culture and trying to express the rebelliousness while throwing out all the motives. Through our curiosity and research, we created a cult of our own. At the beginning, Vivienne really rode hard for Malcolm's anarchistic beliefs, which suggested an outlet for her indignation towards the world. But she would later become disenchanted with his rantings for a revolution when his actions and those of the punk movement didn't reflect the real change she wished to enact. For Vivienne, punk was driven by her stand against human suffering and the mismanagement of the world. But in the end, and for a long time, she saw punk as nothing more than a bout of anger and frustration brought on through chaos. We will discuss all of this more, but in the end, after punk died, Vivienne would refuse to acknowledge her role in the movement, flat out deny it. But we should probably talk about punk so that we can talk about why in Vivienne's eyes the movement failed. So let's freaking go. The punk movement in Britain that we think of today was spearheaded by Malcolm McLaren, who was able to channel his childhood anger into real anarchy. He did so with La Société du Spectacle, and he will do so with punk. In late 1974, Malcolm bored of London and Vivienne left. He went to the US, set his sights on managing the New York Dolls, and vowed never to return. He would return within 6 months. During his time away, Vivienne remained in London, but she was tired of being overshadowed and was determined to work on her image. If you asked people back then, they would never have described Vivienne as eccentric. They would have said that she just copied whatever Malcolm told her to do and developed this persona that wasn't her own. But after Malcolm left, she began walking in high heels, dressing in see-through skin-tight rubber shirts and negligee. And she began seeing playwright Jonathan Gems, who said she would often wear rubber bondage gear and sexually explicit t-shirts as everyday attire to the laundromat, the grocery store, and while out and about. Gems said it was obvious at this time she was very lonely and felt left behind by Malcolm. She really just wanted to get involved in something, in anything, but nothing had gone right for her. In 1973, Pamela Rook, aka Jordan, came to work at Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die. And Jordan, as we will refer to her, quickly overshadowed Vivienne. Jordan eclipsed everyone and everything in sight. She was a goddess to the youth. Even today, she is credited as one of the original creators of the punk movement, usurping Vivienne as the female icon. She was curvy, wore black kohl around her eyes, and had a white peroxide beehive. She became the physical personification of the store's mission of sexual fetish wear as outerwear and anarchic punk. She was unlike Vivienne in every way. She dressed sexually to educate and arouse. Men came from everywhere to admire her, and unlike Vivienne, she didn't hang on to Malcolm's every word. She did her own thing and listened to no one. She was the one who began painting stripes onto t-shirts and pinning communist and Nazi emblems onto her clothes. Vivienne would go on to exploit this look, as well as other various things that punk youths came up with during these next few years. At Sex, Jordan was the one to instill the powerful, intimidating atmosphere, where she would stand by a rubber-clad bed wearing a leather bra and stilettos, and she would scan the room without a hint of humor or solicitation. Like Vivienne, though, Jordan hoped that fetish wear would provoke a sexual revolution in England, but Vivienne was jealous of her, the same way she was jealous of her sister Olga, viewing the independent Jordan as a threat. She often treated female employees with an air of condescension, as she often felt threatened or envious of their sexual attractiveness. Jordan even said, "Vivienne's always been different with men and women, and I used to think she just looked at people's exterior and what they dressed like too much, but I also think it's to do with how she could mold someone. I had my own mind and vision about how I dressed and looked. I wasn't someone she could mold, and she likes to treat people like a project." Vivienne had a really odd relationship with women in that she would tolerate disrespect and abuse from men because she believed they could help her transcend and make something of herself. But she failed to develop a profound female relationship, often casting women off as weak or doll-like. Any strong woman was seen as a sexual and intellectual threat, but all men got a pass. And another employee said that it never failed to surprise her how she trusted the scummiest men. Yeah, she trusted some very scummy men. But we'll get into that. But this whole period really changed the dynamic of their relationship. While Malcolm was in New York, he became wrapped up in Richard Hell, saying Hell was a guy looking like he'd just grown out of a drain hole, covered in slime, no one gave a fuck about him, and looking like he didn't really give a fuck about you. He was this wonderful, bored, drained, scared, dirty guy with a torn t-shirt and this spiky hair. Everything about it. There was no question that I'd take it back to London. I was going to transform it into something more English. He would form his own band, like the New York Dolls, and start his own sexual revolution in London. And Cuddy Jones and his Sex Pistols were ready. In May 1975, Malcolm decided to manage the Strand, the band consisting of Glenn Matlock, Paul Cook, and Steve Jones, who had already been begging Malcolm to manage their band. It really was just an opportunity and luck. So while Malcolm busied himself with the band, Vivienne was running Sex, making t-shirts featuring anti-heroes, rebels, mass murderers, and terrorists who all attacked the moral majority of the establishment. She took Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, and Snow White and put them on t-shirts. She depicted the two mice having sex. Mickey also had an anarchist symbol tattooed on his ear, and Snow White was surrounded by sexually charged dwarves. It was a direct attack on the Disneyfication of childhood and the American entertainment industry that had robbed children of their imagination and left them dependent on commercially driven cartoons. She even made t-shirts with the slogans, "Only anarchists are pretty," "Dangerously close to love," and "Chaos," as well as a t-shirt in ode to Buenaventura Durruti with the slogan, "We are not afraid of ruins." as Durruti and his group used to blow up buildings and leave signs in their wake that read, "We are not afraid of ruins. We built the buildings. We can build them again." That's so hardcore. I love that so much. The shift in sex clothing getting more political was thanks to Vivienne, who was becoming more and more aware of the terrible politicians and how cruel, corrupt, dangerous, and appalling the world could be. For her, the idea was that the youth could put a stick in the wheel of their terrible killing machine, and that is why she started to include the anarchy symbol in her work, because she was an anarchist. And that is why she personally sought out source material that was political, sexual, and social in nature. With her saying Malcolm wasn't interested in the politics of it all, he just hated everybody. And while Vivienne really was the driving force behind the shift in sex clothing, their work really was quite collaborative, because contrary to her last statements, Vivienne hung on to Malcolm's every word. She invested her energy into pleasing him with her designs and feared that without him, she would never achieve anything. Telling people, I needed Malcolm's ideas, because as much as I hate to admit it myself, Malcolm was able to push her designs further. Together, they had this ability to harness raw power and anger.
She would follow on any wheeze or whim or fancy I had. And I think fundamentally believed in me and thought it was all fascinating and fantastic, and would immediately assemble herself on a Saturday night in a giant condom, that was like a see-through latex suit. No, totally jump in at the deep end. At one point or another, having gone around and bought old clothes and set up a shop called Let It Rock in 1971, I decided I wanted to concoct some things myself, either recut things or rework things or slam a slogan on something or customize stuff. Vivienne, being totally craft, and me being very art, formed a kind of an alliance in which she did all the bloody work and I did all the folderols and ideas and all the stuff that lazy buggers like people like me do.
With Malcolm saying, I wasn't caring, and I had much more sense of humor. She preferred order, I preferred chaos. Chaos made me creative. Vivienne always had to be very serious all of the time. I was never hindered. It was a great counterbalance, and I'll cherish that forever. And I actually think that's probably the closest thing we'll ever get to the truth between them, because a lot of people had to say that. She was very serious. She took the clothing very seriously, and Malcolm did not. But yeah, that was a really great counterbalance between them. Because Vivienne wasn't 100% confident in her work. She found herself anxious to show Malcolm anything she had designed out of fear he would find it ridiculous. And on one occasion, having been inspired by a cotton men's shirt Jordan painted stripes onto, Vivienne designed her own anarchy shirt, with bleached stripes and a silk patch painted with the face of Karl Marx. And the whole thing was covered in Iggy Pop lyrics, as Iggy Pop is often referred to as the godfather of punk. Vivienne worried Malcolm wouldn't like the design, so she hid it in the closet, only for him to find it and tell her to keep designing in this vein. Vivienne really needed to find her confidence, but Malcolm was also known to exploit her fears of disappointing him. Years later, he would say, "She was so loyal, it breaks my heart to think I wasn't loyal too." You think? As the changes in design became more and more confrontational, there was a shift happening with the youth, and Malcolm and Vivienne saw that. Everything was changing, and they were going to see the revolution through. In August 1975, Malcolm formed the Sex Pistols, taking Cuddy Jones and his Sex Pistols, aka the Strand, and turning them into a new band. With Vivienne's help, Malcolm formed the band by telling him to bring in John. By John, she meant Simon John Ritchie, aka Sid Vicious, but Malcolm confusedly brought in John Linden, aka Johnny Rotten. Sid Vicious wouldn't formally join the band until 1975, but by bringing in John Linden, or Johnny Rotten as we'll call him, the Sex Pistols were able to become what they were, and what Vivienne and Malcolm wanted them to be. Okay, so I know I said we were going to talk about punk and we're going to talk about the Sex Pistols, but this is where I think I've decided to end part one because there's still so much left to talk about. And I know I only gave a little teaser of what punk is, but I promise part two will be packed with everything punk was and is. We'll talk about sex some more, Seditionaries, World End, and the Sex Pistols. Part two is going to be longer and filled with apocalyptic anarchy, so just get ready to rage. And I don't know, maybe set up notifications so you don't miss anything. But alas, I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day or a good night, and I'll see you very soon. I promise. Bye.